Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Listeners, if you follow me on socials, it will come as no surprise to you that not only am I a fan of historical fiction, but I am a fan of Tania Blanchard's writing, an Australian best-selling author whose skill as a storyteller has gone from strength to strength in the 6 or 7 years that I have known her. From her debut novel, The Girl From Munich, to her latest, Tania has cemented her place as an international best-selling author and a powerhouse in the historical fiction space. And I'm simply delighted to welcome Tania back to the podcast today to chat about her most recent career milestone, her 6th novel, An Undeniable Voice, published by HarperCollins Australia. Welcome, Tania.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine, for having me here today. I'm so excited to talk to you about my latest book.
I'm always excited to talk to you, Tania. And I wanted to say congratulations on this remarkable book. It's been out in the world for a couple of weeks now. So how are you feeling about it?
Oh, fantastic. It's received a really great response. Readers are loving it. I think they're quite surprised by some of the things they're discovering in the book. So it's doing very well. So I'm really pleased with the reader response.
Fantastic. Now, this is a book which picks up where a woman of courage finishes off, and it follows Englishwoman Hannah Rainforth's journey to fight for women's right to vote and all that they endured to have this right enshrined in law. And as I've said to you previously, it's an incredibly moving and heart-wrenching read. I've described it as a book that truly enables women everywhere to understand that today we are standing on the shoulders of giants, because it's about the women who came before us, the women who fought for our rights to be treated as equal citizens in the eyes of the law, the women who fought for our right to be heard and who sacrificed their dignity, their bodies, and some even their lives to help create a world in which women were seen not just as an appendage to their husbands or fathers, but as citizens in their own right. But in thinking about how you came to be writing about Hannah and her involvement in the suffrage movement, there's a special story that I wondered if you could share with listeners today.
Yeah, well, the inspiration, as you know, for all of my stories are my own family stories. This time I turned to my husband's family stories with The Woman of Courage. And I remember some years ago, my father-in-law telling me this lovely story over a pot of tea. He loved strong black tea, just like I did, and he used to pour it out of this great tin teapot. So it was always full of flavour. So I remember vividly sitting with him and listening to his stories, because he's a fantastic storyteller as well. And he told me about the story of how the Blanchards back in England in the turn of the 20th century owned and ran this pub in the north of England. And he was enormously proud of his family history in running this pub, and how excited he was that is in fact his great-grandfather ran this pub. And I love listening to the story, and I wondered, like, amazing, how would life have been for his family members at that time, at the turn of the 20th century, where so much change was happening in England and all of Europe, really. I also wondered a bit about his ancestors. So his ancestor's name was Robert Blanchard, and his wife was Eleanor. I wondered what Eleanor's life might have been like as a wife of a publican. And I tried to find out a little bit more about him, but my father-in-law didn't know very much more about her, except that she was a wife and mother. I was actually able to talk to my father-in-law's cousin in the UK, who still lives in Durham, about that family member, Eleanor. And he too didn't know very much about her. It was his grandmother, in fact, and he really only knew her as a much older woman and didn't have many stories about her as a young woman at all. And I found this all really intriguing. So I went away and did some research on the Ancestry website, was able to pull up some documents, especially the census documents, which give so much valuable information as to a person's life. I found Eleanor on the census documents for 1893. And I was fascinated to discover that she was actually living in the very same pub that her and her husband ran years later. And she was living there with her parents. And another little tidbit of information was that Eleanor was, in fact, a teacher. So, first of all, I was fascinated to see that the pub actually came from Eleanor's family. And this didn't translate into the story when I heard it many years later. Yeah, I just really wondered about how this woman's story had been lost over the generations of telling. And I really thought, no, I really want to know so much more about her and what her life was like. I went away and did a bit of research around the turn of the 20th century, late 1890s, essentially, and discovered that the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, was really gaining momentum at that time. I found that fascinating that the UK didn't get the vote for women so much later than women here in Australia and, in fact, New Zealand. New Zealand was the first country to get the vote for women in 1893 and South Australia in 1894. And in fact, Australia nationally was 1903. Britain didn't get the vote for women for another more than a decade later, towards the end of World War One, in fact. So I thought, why? Why is this so? I really wanted to understand what the process was with the suffrage fight in Britain and why they got the vote so much later than we did here in Australia. And I also discovered that teachers were really heavily involved in the early suffrage movement. They were fighting not just for the vote for women, but for educational rights for all children, and especially for girls and for women. And of course, Eleanor being a teacher, I thought, my goodness, I wonder if she was involved in the suffrage movement. And I just had to kind of weave those two stories together.
Every time you talk about it with me, I find it so endlessly fascinating. So let's talk about Hannah. We meet Hannah in A Woman of Courage when the suffrage movement was in its infancy, which, as you say, is in the late 1890s. What was life like for women like Hannah at that time?
Yeah, at that time, women had actually received the right to own property, especially married women. And that happened in the 1880s. Things were actually progressing for women at that time. So we've come from an era, say in the I'll say the 1860s, 1870s, where women were described as angels in the home. They were domestic goddesses, essentially doing everything for their families, looking after their husbands, living and working in the home, basically. So their rights were quite limited at that time. And then through the social reforms in the 1860s and 70s and into the 1880s, women began to have a lot more rights. They had some form of independence in regards to property from their husbands. And there were a raft of other social reforms that gave them certain independences at that time too. But they were still very much tied to their husbands. There was the rise then of the new woman. So women by that stage in the sort of 1890s, all women, everyone across Britain could really essentially read by then. It had been 20 years since reading and school was mandatory for children and they learnt to read at school. So most women of an adult age were able now to read, gaining a little bit more leisure time. They were able to read newspapers and articles and even novels. They were able to go out to the department stores and buy these beautiful things with the new manufacturing. So life was starting to really lift for these women. So they were educated women, the new women. They wanted these new progressive ideas in their own lives. They wanted to be able to become a bit more independent. They pursued sports now like tennis and bicycle riding. Their clothing changed as a result of this too. It became a lot more simple. Their skirts rose a little bit to be able to cope with these practicalities of daily life and their activities and their sporting pursuits as well. So that's essentially how life was like at the beginning of A Woman of Courage with Hannah.
Yeah, indeed. Fantastic. So I remember talking to you after A Woman of Courage was published and marveling at the various hardships and injustices faced by women in this story and the breadth of work that was undertaken by the suffragists at the time. And in the time between Hannah becoming involved in the movement in that first book and the opening of this new book in 1906, how had things changed, do you think?
Yeah, there was a lot of change in this short period of time, further social reforms, but some things hadn't changed at all. As I say, women were becoming a lot more independent. the beginning of An Undeniable Voice, Hannah reflects on some news articles that she's reading about how women have now taken up as being balloonists and being able to fly from France across to the British coast, and how amazing even that technology was, and the fact that women were doing it. There were female racing car drivers, again, a very new technology to be able to drive a car. So women were really breaking so many of those barriers and restrictions on them. The new woman was well and truly out there. There were still quite a few restrictions on women, and the main things that Hannah picks up in her story are the restrictions on women around owning property. As a married woman, she could own property, but if she was married and wanted to buy property, she had to do this through her husband. And that was the same with the business. If she needed a loan or a mortgage, she had to sign that with her husband. She couldn't do that on her own. There was a legal dependence still on her husband. And women at this time also couldn't own bank accounts on their own merits either. They had to have them co-signed by their husbands, fathers, or some kind of male relative. So financial freedom wasn't a thing that women had then, all this legal independence. And in fact, that didn't come for many, many years later. In fact, in the really 1960s, 70s, and even the 1980s in the UK and also here in Australia. So that actually provided a lot of difficulty for women. Their true independence, they couldn't really exercise that when they had these kind of restrictions on them. Women now also could be awarded degrees for their studies at university. Not all universities allowed this, but certain universities started to award degrees. The main one was really London University, where women could now go and study to be a teacher and receive a qualification at the end of that. Women could be engineers and doctors. Some of the most famous women of the age, Catherine Parsons was a very famous engineer of the time. I don't know whether she actually studied at that university, but there were a lot of women that started to follow in these famous women's footsteps and study at the universities and gain qualifications for engineering and medicine. They were the two really the big areas that women went into at this time. And there were a lot more working women at this time as well, with the rise of textiles industries and factories. And domestic service was still a very big sphere for women to go into work-wise before the war. Women had a lot more leisure time. Popular theatre was an affordable way to seek entertainment through the theatres and the music halls. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, women now could go shopping in the department stores. So things were certainly heading in the right direction for women, but they did face these really fundamental difficulties to their independence, and this is another reason women really, really needed the vote to change this legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Such fascinating insight into the life of women at that time. So, between the first book, A Woman of Courage, and this one, An Undeniable Voice, Hannah had actually stepped away from the suffrage movement for some years. Obviously, she was raising her family and she was running the pub with her husband, Roger. But then something happens that causes Hannah to want to throw herself back into the fight, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, her children are now at an age where she feels comfortable to be able to think about, entertain the idea of going back to the national fight. And in February 1907, there's this first major demonstration held in London, calling on women and all supporters of the suffrage movement to come to London for this massive demonstration to show the government that women really did want the vote. Because up until this time, there had been talk that members of parliament didn't want, or thought that women didn't really want the vote. There weren't enough women that wanted the vote. So they hoped to prove the MPs wrong with the upcoming new bill that was going to be passed, or going to go through to parliament with a women's suffrage portion to this bill. So they hoped to prove the government wrong. Everyone wanted the vote. Hannah was really very excited about this idea, because the parliamentary process that her friend Millicent Fawcett was heavily involved in, and the members of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, it was slow. Every bill that had gone through or gone to Parliament at this time had failed. It never got passed. And there was growing frustration, because lobbying and talking to MPs and following this political process wasn't getting them really anywhere. This demonstration was the first change in types of activities to try and promote the suffrage movement. And there was a real action, a calling for action. And all of these collective voices together, Hannah thought, surely now the government has to listen. All of these people want women to have the vote. And that really propelled her forwards to going to what became known as the Mud March. It was a very rainy day in London and it was very muddy. Very, very high expectations, a real feeling of hope for the future really came with this first big demonstration.
Leading on from that first big demonstration, there was another event that happened that really made Hannah understand that the fight was on. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So in 1910, it was November 1910, there was another big demonstration that happened. So following the first demonstration, there were a number of demonstrations after this point, all peaceful demonstrations and protests asking the government to, give women the vote. They all had their placards, votes for women. Women congregated outside of Parliament after finding out that the latest bill had failed again. And they wanted to put in a deputation into the MPs inside of the House of Commons to say, hey, what's going on? Why didn't we get the vote? What can we do? It was all very peaceful and logical. So outside the Parliament, this deputation had been pushed back. They were told they can't see the MPs. And so women were getting quite frustrated, but it was still a peaceful process and a peaceful protest. And there was quite a big police presence for the very first time. None of the women were aware of what was about to happen. And in fact, the police actually began to clash with the women, even though they were peaceful protesting. It escalated to this incredible, horrific event where women were bashed and brutalized and hit, thrown into the crowd that was surrounding them, which was filled with men, what they called roughs at the time. So these were men that were kind of called in by the police, possibly, to rough up these women a bit more. So it was the first occasion of brutality on such a massive scale. Women went away bleeding and bruised and damaged. There were a number of women that actually died of their injuries months later. So this was the very first time that Hannah saw women being brutalized and this terrible violence against them happening just for purely asking for the vote in a peaceful manner. So this really galvanized her into action, thought, okay, I can't stand by anymore and just watch this sort of thing happen. I must join the suffragette action and go out into the streets and really become heavily involved in this national action to get the vote for women. And this became increasingly militant over time.
It certainly did. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But I
Mm.
kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about the fact that oppression in the form of violence against women is something that you've, obviously addressed in this novel, and your descriptions of which, particularly that Black Friday march, these were heart-wrenching descriptions to say the least. And despite how far we've come in this fight for equality, this is something that continues to be an issue right up until this day. And I wondered, Tania, if you could talk to us a little bit about how you were feeling about writing this and seeing that whilst we have come so far in so many ways, in other ways we haven't.
Absolutely right. There's so many parallels to today. I had no idea when I began researching how much violence was perpetrated against women who were protesting peacefully. I found it very fascinating to learn that even though the suffragettes began with peaceful protest, their motto was deeds, not words. And they began with heckling MPs and chaining themselves to grills just to get their cause out there in the public arena. They also chose to go to prison instead of pay fines for these small infractions, again to promote their cause. But their calls for the vote for women fell on deaf ears, and the more that happened, the more they thought we've got to up the ante here. So in 1909, women began to actually hunger strike in prison. And this very rapidly gave cause for concern to prison officials and the government. Very shortly after began this terribly dark period of forcible feeding of women in prison. Women were held down, tubes were forced down their throats and their noses, and they were forcibly fed liquid liquid goodness, milk and eggs and that sort of thing, even though they were gagging and vomiting and screaming. Reading first-hand accounts from these fantastic National Archive materials, British Archive materials. Also, the Museum of London had some fascinating information on this as well, about these women that underwent this forcible feeding. Really shocked me to the core. And I thought to myself, how incredibly brave these women were to put their bodies on the line like this for their cause. And that hasn't changed in many ways today. I think reading and writing about the oppression that women experienced in the early 1900s and their efforts to resist that oppression with the rising violence that was occurring, and trying to, in their desperation, to find more ways, better ways, more vocal ways to promote their cause and to showcase what was happening to them. Certainly, we can see all across the world today. So it was quite eerie in a lot of ways to write about this violence and this oppression, knowing that we have come a long way since women have got the vote, since women were fighting back in that day and age. But there are so many inequalities that still occur today that we continue to need to fight against. And how far do we have to go to get those inequalities changed? Do we have to go as far as the suffragettes did in their day? I certainly hope not, but it's interesting to kind of speculate and look at.
Yeah, just as you were talking, it reminded me that we're coming up to that time of year where, we in Sydney, I don't know if this is the case around Australia, but where marches are organised in
Mm.
response to violence against women. I think it might be a nationwide thing, but
Yep.
it is so interesting because it has occurred to me also that not only is it in relation to, women's rights, but resistance is something that we're seeing all around the world at the moment, and vocalization against oppression is something that we're seeing a rise in. But also in the context of Hannah's fight, in those years before World War One, women were really ramping up not only their fight for the vote, but ramping up their response to the desperation and oppression, to their lack of agency and their lack of enfranchisement. But all of that changed when World War One came along, didn't it?
Well, that's right. As you mentioned, that ramping up, the women went from peaceful protest to window smashing. And then they went from window smashing of government buildings and shop fronts to arson, because the government was just turning a blind eye. They weren't listening to anything that the women were saying. Then they were, firebombing and these arson attacks, letter bombs, and attacking MPs' homes. There was never the idea of trying to injure people or cause deaths, but something I didn't mention earlier, with the rising desperation came rising attempts to do something about it. They were bombing trains and churches. They tried to bomb the Bank of England. The more that they kept trying to get change happening, the more desperate they became when it didn't, and inevitably lives were lost. And women who were arrested for these sorts of crimes ended up doing long stints in prison. So when World War One came, nothing had changed. Hannah was really despairing of where this clash was going to end between police and authorities and the suffragettes, because neither was willing to budge. She was really worried, where is this going to end? With the war, the suffrage movement was put on hold. The militant action was paused, and suffragettes were released from prison. Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes, they turned their attention to the war effort and to enlisting men to fight on the front, and began the whole white feather campaign to shame men into enlisting. Millicent Fawcett and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, they turned their attention to the war effort as well, although Millicent kept working in the background for that parliamentary process, continuing on that stream. But they also set up, or were very heavily involved in financing and setting up, the Scottish women's hospitals for foreign service, allowing female doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, stretcher bearers, all of those people involved in the hospital setting, women, to be involved in the war effort overseas. A lot of these, especially female doctors, weren't accepted by the Royal Medical Corps. They did their service and their bit for their country through this Scottish Women's Hospital. So yeah, that's where that went at the beginning of World War One. That really diffused the whole violent situation as Britain, was at war. This national threat overshadowed everything else.
Absolutely. And I'm really grateful that you mentioned both Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst, because these were two real life historical figures that make an appearance in both A Woman of Courage and An Undeniable Voice. And I feel like their lives and their work with the suffragette movement really impacted both these stories.
Yeah, yeah, it really did. Both women were sort of instrumental to their cause, particularly in An Undeniable Voice. Both of them are on the periphery of the story, but certainly are woven into the context of what happens with Hannah during the story. Hannah and Millicent Fawcett have struck up a friendship, and they write to each other backwards and forwards with these beautiful letters. And Hannah is a great supporter of Millicent Fawcett and is in awe of her parliamentary process, her logical thinking, her incredible influence, and her pragmatism. She was a woman that believed all women should have the vote, but if the parliamentarians were willing to give them small gains, she was willing to go for that, eventually to get all women the vote. She really loved her for that. Millicent Fawcett was involved in the suffrage movement for nearly 60 years. During its infancy, even in the 1860s, she was involved then and became president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies until 1919. I was really lucky to be able to find a book online that she wrote, Victory for Women and After, I think it was called. And it details her activities and her thought processes of all that went on with the suffrage movement between 1911 and 1919, and gave me really great insights into the way she thought about things and how she was personally behind the scenes involved in a lot that went on during that time. She was a mover and shaker, let me say. And that really influenced the way I was able to include this kind of detail into the story through her letters with Hannah. That was a real joy to be able to do that. She was obviously highly influential then in the war years in pushing for the vote for women and ultimately gaining that for them. Emmeline Pankhurst, on the other hand, is a little bit more of a periphery figure in the story, but she still does sort of come up quite a bit because she was the leader of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which was formed in 1903 in frustration for the failure of this parliamentary process. The women were not getting these bills through Parliament, and she believed they needed to be doing a lot more, and this is where the deeds not words motto began with her. She formed the organisation with her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. And Christabel, as it turns out, over the years became the more militant one of the three. She really was the one that put together a lot of the arson and bombing campaigns. I would suspect, with blessing from her mother sanctioned these activities, even though she wasn't involved herself. Emmeline Pankhurst was a really influential figure because she was so publicly known. She was a very public figure and had gained a lot of respect in a lot of circles. I think I mentioned earlier that she was imprisoned in 1913 and for one of the longest stints in prison for the bombing of David Lloyd George's summer house, which was being partially built. Even though she wasn't involved in what happened, she took responsibility. She was sentenced to 3 years hard labour in prison. And because she was such a public figure, I think the parliamentarians knew that she would probably be involved again in some hunger strikes. And up to this point, she had never been forcibly fed. And they knew what a backlash it would be if she was forcibly fed in prison. And so a new act came forward, the Cat and Mouse Act. It was dubbed the Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed for women that were imprisoned that actually had undergone hunger strikes to return home when they were unwell to regain their health. And once that had occurred, they would return to prison and serve out the rest of their sentence. And they thought in this way they could protect Emmeline Pankhurst and the backlash that would occur if she did undergo forcible feeding. So, of course, she did go home during this time, and then she absconded, as a lot of women did as a result of this act. She went to the US and spread the word about the women's suffrage movement over there. And Christabel also had fled Britain, and she was holed up in Paris and ran the suffragette newspaper and began all of the militant actions and campaigns from Paris. And of course, as I mentioned earlier too, then when the war came, Emmeline Pankhurst turned her attention to enlisting men to fight in the war and was quite passionate about that project as well. And so she's always remained a really respected and influential figure with the suffrage movement. And I think she and her daughters are much more recognisable even today in this day and age than Millicent Fawcett ever has been, even though she was there for the very long haul. So I found that really fascinating to balance those two women on the page with Hannah at the centre of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of what you have just described, Tanya, is so endlessly fascinating to me. And I think that is the attraction for me in reading historical fiction is learning about all of these things that I probably wouldn't otherwise ever come across. And I find that so wonderful. And it's wonderful that you're able to inject your storytelling with all these incredible facts about what life was like for women back in the day.
Yeah, and that's what I love about writing these kind of stories. I start with an idea and then in the process of the research, learn so much more that I didn't know myself. And I'm thinking to myself, I've got to share this with other people. They probably don't know either. And I really want them to understand what I've understood through this process of the research. And yeah, it's part of my storytelling to share an understanding of that historical time in my story.
Do you think you'll continue writing historical fiction?
Absolutely. I love it. I'm a history buff from way back. I loved history at school. I've kind of fallen into my passion. It's a perfect niche for me, writing and family stories as well. I've always loved family stories. I grew up with them, listening to my grandmother's stories. So family history has a rich background in my family and then history, on top of that, and writing. So it's a perfect combination for me. And also, I really love being able to tell the story of ordinary people and how they react to the historical events of their time. And often I find that these are stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. And, it really tells us about the amazing human spirit and what we're capable of.
I couldn't agree with you more. Tanya, thinking about an undeniable voice, what would you hope readers will take away from this story?
Well, I think the biggest thing is an understanding of what women went through to get the vote for women. In Britain, with the suffragettes, most particularly, they sacrificed their bodies, their reputations, their families. They put themselves on the line. They risked their lives. They sacrificed so much, and the extent that they went to, that they were willing to go to promote the cause and to actually get the physical vote for women. That really, really, I find is incredibly inspiring. So I'd like people to understand that kind of process and what they went for to give us the privilege of the vote that we have today. A lot of us take that for granted, but women really went to great lengths to get that for us as an undeniable right today. And I guess the other thing is that I really wanted to explore and showcase how the collective voice of women together can make the difference. And as much as that there are still great inequalities out there today, if we all stand together and speak as one voice or many voices together even, our voices are undeniable. We have to eventually get to where we want to go and get those inequalities changed. It might take time. It could be like with the whole US election results and Kamala Harris, we all had great hopes that she would become president, but it's two steps forward, one step back, and we will make inroads and we will get there in the end.
Tanya, as I mentioned earlier, this is your sixth novel. So I wanted to ask you, does writing novels get easier for you?
I don't know about easier. I think I have learned I've learned to accept and understand what my style is like and my writing process is like. And I suppose now that I'm able to just go with that process, it does often tend to flow easier. That sometimes there are parts of a book that are more difficult to write than others, that you don't want to go into those deep emotional depths and feel those things yourself. But that's something you have to wrestle with and find that headspace to do. The research is always a lengthy process, but I love it. So no, I wouldn't say that they get necessarily easier. It's just each book is really quite different, but I suppose in some respects it's easier because I understand myself better. I understand the way that I'm writing, and actually I'm evolving as a writer and in my writing process as well. With this particular book, I did change the way I began writing it and wrote the scenes that I really wanted to write about first, things I was really passionate about and could see fully formed in my head. So they formed the basis of the first draft. And then from there, I went to great lengths to plot the rest of the book about where the exciting scenes needed to be, where a bit more detail about the suffrage movement needed to go, a bit more about Hannah's life. So I thought through the process a little bit more um, in a structured way this time, as opposed to intuitively writing it as I had done before. And for one thing, I suppose there were a lot fewer words in that first draft or the second draft, which was good. So it was a lot more time efficient. And I feel that I was able to get to the end point a lot faster with greater clarity and really crystallizing those thoughts together a lot quicker as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. I love that. So I understood that you had another two books possibly coming out with
Yeah.
HarperCollins. So I wanted to ask you, was there anything that you could tell us about those next projects?
Yeah, I think I'm going to turn my attention now to, again, it's going to be about family stories, but rather than telling the actual family story, I want to explore how our family stories and family history influence us here in Australia. Obviously, we have a really long history of migration in this country and very varied as well. So I want to explore how the migrant story, how the family histories and the family stories going back to other countries have influenced the people that live here in Australia at various times and have coloured their experiences and essentially then Australia's history and the change in Australia's history over time as a result of those stories and those migrant experiences. So that's perhaps where I'm going with my next two books, which will be essentially set in Australia, although there will be um, scenes and parts of those books set elsewhere as well. So that's where the next two books are going to go. I can say with this next one that there is some kind of a connection to an undeniable voice. I won't say exactly what that is, but there is that connection there. So, and a continuation of a family story potentially. That's where I'm headed with those next two books.
Fantastic. Okay, so you know, Tanya, that there are a lot of aspiring authors who listen to this podcast. And so I was wondering what advice you might offer to any of those out there in terms of getting published and about staying on course and building a long-term career.
Yeah, they're really good questions. I think that's something we all struggle with at the very beginning of our career. It's such an uncertain process, but I think essentially the things that we all need to think about are doing what we love. Like it's really important to write what you love because that's going to shine through on the page with authenticity, and that goes a long way to being published and having that length of career because people are going to see that passion on the page and want to read what you have to write each time. In regards of actually getting through a manuscript, for me, it's always been following a word count. Once you're published, there are those really tight deadlines. But even with the first novel, I felt important that I worked to a deadline each week with word count, a certain number of words each week. So there was an end point in sight. And I wouldn't go back and edit until I had finished that first draft. And that meant that I actually got to an end point and I could see the overarching story and how it flowed, and then I could go back and edit from that point. Otherwise, I think the danger is to continually edit to get to what you perceive as a perfect point, which never is a perfect point, and you never get to the final product, to the final end, and progress that story into the next draft. So I think that's really important as well. I think it's about having that belief in yourself. You gotta believe in yourself. Reach out to other writers and authors. They are such a strong, supportive network. That has certainly buoyed me up in times of difficulty or uncertainty, having fellow authors and writers around me. We share our stories and give each other hope and positivity. So I think that's also really important.
Yeah, thank you so much. So very well said. Listeners, if you haven't read this book yet, you're in for a special experience. And once you have, I guarantee you'll want to put it into the hands of every woman you know. Tania, I wish you every success with an undeniable voice and the books that will no doubt follow. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much, Claudine, for having me. It was a real honour to be here.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.